Welcome. I'm Fred Rosenbaum. I'm a scholar in residence for the East Bay International Jewish Film Festival. I want to speak to you now on the film Into the Darkness, the Danish film. Now, when we think about Denmark during the Holocaust, one event looms over all else. The boat lift of about 7,200 Jews to neutral Sweden in October 1943. The Nazi plan to deport them to the ghetto and slave labor camp of Theresienstadt, that was foiled by a well-organized operation involving thousands of Danes. The rescuers were resistance fighters and civilian fishermen. Danish police and government officials helped. And ordinary citizens who made their homes into havens for Jews before they sailed to safety. Over 95% of the Jewish population was rescued. The best record in all of Nazi-occupied Europe, where 2 out of every 3 Jews were murdered. Norway, which also shared a border with Sweden, saw 1/3 of its Jews caught and then murdered in Auschwitz. The Copenhagen boat lift is perhaps the most positive story in the entire Shoah, and it is paramount in Danish national identity. They think of themselves as a uniquely decent, courageous people who safeguarded their fellow citizens. The dramatic deed has also formed the way Jews think of the Danes. Yad Vashem's Garden of the Righteous has a tree planted in honor of the Danish people as a whole. No other country has that. To be sure, Denmark's bravery has sometimes been spun into myth by leading authors such as Leon Uris, who wrote that the king rode on horseback through the capital wearing the yellow star. I think most of you know that did not happen. But the rescue of October 1943, covered in countless books and movies, that stands as a tremendous act of altruism. Yet the film Into the Darkness is not about that. It ends half a year before the boat lift, and it focuses instead on Danish behavior that is not so gratifying. One upper-class family is a microcosm of the varied reactions of Danes to the German occupation, ranging from war profiteering to literally sleeping with the enemy, and even committing atrocities. It portrays violent and non-violent resistance too. And it also depicts apathy, which was perhaps the most widespread reaction of all. This movie reflects the debate now raging among Danish historians as a new generation seeks to move beyond the heroic waterborne rescue and examine the full spectrum of Danish responses during the war, including the dark side that has long been swept under the rug. Perhaps the Danes' worst misdeed was callous indifference to the non-Danish Jews, which began even before the occupation, when they weren't masters in their own house. As early as 1935, they refused to admit Jewish refugees. with a policy even more restrictive than that of France, Holland, and Belgium. And during the war, they even sent 23 fugitive Jews back to Germany, almost all of whom were murdered. And the film dramatizes the tragedy of two of them. But this movie has relatively little about the Jews. Rather, the impact of wartime upheaval on the general population is shown, and in a way we can grasp. A film on occupied Poland, by contrast, would depict almost a different universe than ours. That was a slave state in which one's life hung in the balance every day. 3 million non-Jewish Poles were killed by the Nazis. There were moral decisions to be made, of course, but these were often stark life or death choices, which often had to be made suddenly. This film portrays the opposite kind of occupation. The first 3 years of accommodation between Germany and Denmark, 1940 to 43, which was transactional, not a master-slave relationship, and thus more in a gray area ethically. This period is called by Holocaust scholars one of accommodation, negotiation, and compromise. In short, a relatively mild occupation despite the obvious power imbalance. Why did the Germans go so easy on the Danes? Because unlike the rest of Europe, Denmark and the other Scandinavian nations were highly regarded by the Germans as Aryan, the land of the Vikings, so central in the pagan ideology that was Nazism. The German naval officer in the film tells the Danish family that he visits that he admires Viking bravery, as he puts it, and is interested in Norse mythology. Many educated Danes spoke German well. You see that in the film. There were 70,000 ethnic Danes living in northern Germany at the time, and they were fully integrated. Now, to be sure, Denmark had been wary of Germany since the War of 1864, when they lost the southern part of their country to Prussia, never to get it back. So this is a classic relationship between a mighty country and a smaller, vulnerable neighbor. To paraphrase a diplomatic expression, when Germany sneezes, Denmark catches cold. So there was a fear of Germany, but also familiarity and a kind of grudging respect. Now, the film opens on April 9th, 1940, with the Wehrmacht invasion and the immediate inception of this 3.5-year period of accommodation. There is no fighting beyond a brief border skirmish. Denmark surrenders in 2 hours. What is the compromise their leaders quickly reach with the Nazis? Well, they are required to ship manufactured goods and even more so food to Germany. 1/5 of all the Third Reich's produce during the war came from Denmark, 1/5. They allow the Wehrmacht to build air bases and station troops in their country. But life goes on. They keep their king and their parliament and a unity government led by social democrats. All of that is in place. How rare is that for a country in the Nazi orbit. They keep their judges and their courts, their police, even their armed forces. The standard of living is the highest in occupied Europe, even higher than in Germany itself. In turn, the Danes waged little resistance until the last year and a half or so of this period of accommodation. The Nazis called tranquil Denmark the model protectorate, and every German soldier longed for a posting there. As opposed to the Eastern or Western Front, Denmark was called the cream front because of the plenitude of dairy products. But how did the Danes react to this deal their government hastily made? They gain a relatively high degree of peace and prosperity, no question. But they are increasingly pressured by their ferocious neighbor to the south. I think of some small countries today, nominally independent, but nevertheless muscled by China, such as the Southeast Asian nations. Or an example in Europe today would be Belarus and Russia's dominance over that country, only nominally independent with its own government. Even during this period of compromise, as we see in the film, the Danish democracy slowly erodes. The society becomes deeply polarized, even pitting family members against one another. Obviously, a main theme of this film. And the government gradually loses the trust of its people. Now, let me turn first to Scandinavia generally in order to put this in historical context. Since there are many references in the movie to the situation in Norway and Sweden. Even those who are familiar with Europe during World War II, I know, are far less knowledgeable about this region. So if we could have the first image, the map of Scandinavia. Thank you. Now, as you look at Scandinavia, the eastern country of Finland is there. That is Nordic, but strictly speaking, not Scandinavian. The language is completely different than that of the other three countries. Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish, they are quite similar in language. Early in the war, Finland was invaded too, but not by Germany, rather by the Soviet Union. So we really have a dissimilar culture and a different wartime experience in Finland. So let's focus instead on the other three countries, which have so much in common. Sister nations, really, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, all predominantly Lutheran. Large parts of Sweden were historically in the Danish kingdom. All of Norway, until the early 19th century, was ruled by Denmark. And the royal families of those three constitutional monarchies have been closely related. The kings of Norway and Denmark during the war were brothers. Now, Sweden is the easiest one to describe of the three. It declared neutrality at the outset, and the Germans respected that status throughout the entire war, as they did with Switzerland, Spain, and Portugal. So that's neutral throughout. The Swedes did have to make two major concessions: ship iron ore to Germany, obviously vital in armaments production, and allow German troops to move through the country. You can see from this map that Sweden is less important strategically than Norway or Denmark. It's further away from Britain, with far less coastline exposed. But the British could occupy Norway, the Germans feared, and with that country's consent. So although Norway and Denmark, like Sweden, were neutral, both were invaded by the Nazis on the same day, April 9th, 1940, the beginning of a massive spring blitzkrieg that year that a month later overran Holland, Belgium, and France. The Germans gave the pretext that they were protecting Norway too from a British invasion. But of course, that would have been impossible militarily in 1940. The Norwegians, unlike the Danes, fought back, and 6,000 of their soldiers and sailors were killed during the 2 full months of combat that ensued. Then they finally capitulated to the much more powerful enemy force. The Nazis soon built naval bases along the Norwegian west coast, from which submarines would terrorize the North Atlantic. And the young German naval officer in the film is stationed at the main naval base in Trondheim. There, thank you for showing that. And you can see the strategic advantage the Germans felt they had, given that that's across the sea from Britain. Now, unlike submissive Denmark, the Norwegian king fled to England, where he set up a government in exile, which aided the resistance throughout the war. As the minister president, the Germans installed Norwegian Nazi Vidkun Quisling, who had near absolute power until 1945. Soon after the war, he was executed for treason. As you know, Quisling's betrayal caused his name to be forever synonymous with traitor, particularly selling out one's country to foreign occupiers. His Nazi party took control. In Denmark, there was also a small Nazi party, but it remained tiny and irrelevant throughout the entire war. Importantly, there was no Danish equivalent of a forceful Hitler worshiper like Quisling, who enthusiastically did the Germans' bidding. Quisling began with a series of punitive anti-Semitic decrees, removing the Jews from all rungs of Norwegian society. The racist anti-Jewish measures were carried out by public officials, including the local police. Passports held by Jews had to be stamped with a large red letter J. There was nothing like this in Denmark. Jews were not persecuted at all during the period of accommodation. Deportation from Norway occurred in October 1942. Over 700 Jews were seized, and almost all of those murdered in Auschwitz. Again, that was 1/3 of the Jewish community of Norway. The victims were rounded up and put on those ships by Norwegians. And recall in the film, the daughter of the Danish family hears about this in Norway itself, where she's living as the wife of a German naval officer. But even those Danes who did not travel abroad were aware of developments in Norway through BBC broadcasts. In short, the Danes wanted to avoid the terrible fate of their sister country, And this was uppermost in their minds during the whole period of accommodation, not to be ruled and ravaged by the Nazis like Norway. Okay, you can remove that map, please. And let's look at the next image, please. Image 2. Now, let's look more closely at Denmark. And to help you follow the film, I've put together this brief timeline. But first, take a look at the map of Denmark, and you see Copenhagen on the east coast there. And look how close that is to Sweden. I'm mentioning this in terms of the boat lift that I spoke about. That's only about 5 miles across. So there was some really big advantages that Jewish community had. And in addition, the overwhelming majority of Danish Jews lived in Copenhagen. So it was possible to get them across the water into Sweden. All right, now let's look at the timeline. What I did was put the period covered by the film in red. See, the film starts 9 months into the war, and then, 6 months into the war, and then it ends in early 1943. So let's look at this. First, September 1 to 3, 1939, as you all know, Germany invades Poland, World War II is declared, and as I've said, Denmark declares neutrality. April 9th, 1940, half a year into the war, as I said, Denmark and Norway are invaded, and Denmark surrenders in 2 hours. The film opens with the German planes flying over Copenhagen. And then on that same day, the 3.5-year period of compromise with Germany begins. And to repeat, Denmark keeps its government, judiciary, and military, but exports goods to Germany. In striking contrast, not just with Norway, but with every other country allied with the Reich. There are no Jewish decrees. In fact, the synagogue in Copenhagen remains open during this period of accommodation and is protected by the Danish government. However, German troops are stationed in Denmark and contact with the Allies was forbidden. In mid-1942, about halfway into this period of accommodation, the Danes are forced to crack down hard on the communists, and we'll come to that later. Now, let's move toward the period that is after the film. August 29th, 1943. The film stops months before this fateful day, when the period of accommodation abruptly ends. Germany occupies Denmark and imposes martial law. They raid all the Danish police stations and disarm the entire force. The Danes themselves scuttle their naval fleet. The Danish cabinet resigns and the country is ruled by a German plenipotentiary, SS General and Gestapo chief, Werner von Best. Only now does Denmark resemble other West European countries under Nazi occupation. And barely a month later, October 1st to 3rd, Germany plans to deport 7,800 Jews, Denmark's Jewish population. But after Jewish leaders were tipped off by a sympathetic German diplomat, almost all of Danish Jewry is hidden in homes and churches and quickly ferried by fishermen to Sweden. Although about 400 Jews were caught and sent to Theresienstadt. And finally, May 5th, 1945, Denmark is liberated by the British, and nearly all Danish Jews in Sweden soon return and continue to live in Denmark. Okay, we can remove that slide. Thank you. Now to the film. Now that we've had that, we've put that in historical context, let's go to the film itself, in which each major character represents a different reaction during the period of accommodation. Some of the reviewers criticized this as being too schematic, too didactic. But for a history teacher, this format is a real gift. Now, I'll begin with Carl, a well-connected industrialist and the family's patriarch, the hub of the story. And to me, its most intriguing character. So let's put up the image of Carl Skov. Now, he is not a bad person. His first marriage failed, but he cares deeply about the welfare of his 5 children, despite the disastrous mistakes they make. He is exceedingly kind to his household staff, almost part of the family. And he's like a father to the workers in his large electronics factory. His instincts are to steer clear of the Germans, but he gets further and further sucked into the Nazi war machine. It's the proverbial Faustian bargain, selling one's soul to the devil. But also, this is kind of a slippery slope. It's the kind of story we see so often in literature, from King Lear to The Great Gatsby. At first, Carl doesn't even want to sell any of his electronic products to the Germans. But with the invasion of April 1940, he loses the lucrative British market, as do the other Danish businessmen. So he feels he has no choice but to trade with the Reich. He draws a distinction: sell them goods, but nothing that can be used for the war effort. Yet soon, facing problems with the banks, creditors, and investors, he has to do just that: ship them components for weapons. It's either that or bankruptcy. He's played by Jesper Christiansen, one of Denmark's greatest actors. The expression on his face in this image reflects his painful predicament in dealing with the Nazis. He must fulfill the big order in 1942 to a company called Siemens in the film. Well, that name is a stand-in for the real Berlin-based electronics giant Siemens, known for its use of slave labor during the war. Finally, he is forced by one of Hitler's top armaments officials. You see him here in the photo. Carl is forced to surrender a large portion of his plant to German supervision. Okay, you can remove that photo now. Thank you. Now, some of his peers and partners are much worse. They're rank opportunists. The film shows several businessmen as caricatures almost, with fat faces, big bellies, savoring thick cigars. "We're making money like never before," one says, grinning. This is not Carl Skov. He's not trying to enrich himself from the war. He's trying to survive, and thus making increasingly agonizing moral choices. A creeping collaboration, you can say. All the more difficult because his devoted wife, Eva, adamantly opposes any involvement with the Germans and time and again is dismayed at his decisions, which fly in the face of her ethical principles. She's willing to close the factory that her father founded and make ends meet by going back to work, even selling their lavish home. But that doesn't sway Karl, who ultimately lies to her about the deals he's cutting with the Nazis. Now, how do we explain this compliance? First of all, the unity government, let me repeat, freely elected before the invasion and still in power, wants cooperation with Germany. The Danish Minister of Trade at the Skov garden party says the country must go along. Beyond that, for the first 2 years of the occupation, the Danish business establishment thinks Germany will win the war. So it wants to position itself to profit from Hitler's domination of Europe now and in the future. Most important, I think, Karl has no idea what he is up against. That is, how ruthless the Nazis really are. He knows the Führer is a tyrant intent on subjugating Europe, but he's unaware of concentration camps and killing fields until his son returns from the Eastern Front and informs him. So he's repeatedly taken by surprise, such as when the Jewish refugees are arrested. He's sure he can sort it out with his friend, the police chief, but he can't. Later, even after they're sent back to Germany, he accepts the lie that they are well. Now, let me recommend 2 outstanding TV series, both available on Amazon Prime, that also deal with the excruciating dilemma of leading businessmen under German occupation. They reluctantly, but inexorably, get increasingly enmeshed with the Nazis. And let's look at the next image, please. Okay, one of these series is A French Village, which covers the entire wartime period, and I recommend that highly. It reflects many of the same themes as Into the Darkness. Let's look at the second one. Seaside Hotel, coincidentally about wealthy Danes, whom you see in this photo. Not one family as in Into the Darkness, but a kind of household nonetheless. Several families that come together at a resort every summer from 1929 to 1942, and they exhibit many of the varied reactions that the Skov family has. 3 of the main actors in Darkness also appear in Seaside. But the tone of this drama is different because it has many lighthearted comic scenes. Okay, you can remove that. Now, let's look at Karl's children and the choices they make. Knut is a jazz musician and almost oblivious to the tumultuous political events swirling around him. When the film opens, he's playing music at home with his younger brother. It's their parents' 25th wedding anniversary, you recall. And he flat out says, "We don't care about the invasion." He thinks it won't affect him, but it does when the following year, pro-Nazi Danish soldiers break into his jazz club. They think such American Negro music, as they call it, is decadent or degenerate. And that's, a major element in the ideology of the Third Reich. The thugs ransacked the club and beat up the young party goers. This is one of the key points of the film. You may think you can stick to your own knitting, so to speak, but that's impossible in the case of a foreign invasion and occupation. No matter how removed from politics you may be, or how uninterested in it, sooner or later you will be impacted by the upheaval. Now to a member of the Skov family with strong political beliefs. Michael, Carl's son by his first marriage, is an officer in the Danish army. Initially, he appears as a Danish nationalist and thus opposes the quick surrender to the Germans. But soon, his fierce animus to communism emerges. We learn that he fought as a volunteer in Finland's Winter War of 1939-40, when that country was attacked by the Soviet Union, which I mentioned earlier, and recruited volunteers from all across Europe. Michael is one of the roughly 1,000 Danes who fought in Finland against Bolshevism. In 1941, though, the stakes are much higher. Michael again combats communism, but this time on the side of Nazi Germany, locked in its titanic struggle with the Red Army. Michael actually joins the Waffen-SS and would later admit to his father that he participated in massacres of innocent men, women, and children. No doubt, the mass execution of Jews. He was one of about 6,000 Danes serving under Hitler and calling themselves the Danish Free Corps. Let's take a look at their recruiting posters. We can have the next image. So notice the appeal here, both to anti-communism, of course, but also Viking mythology. You see that in the image on the left, there's actually, it's almost as if the current Dane who's fighting for the Nazis is some kind of descendant of the Vikings. And then on the right, there's that sword going back again to the early Middle Ages. And the figure is also about to do battle with the Bolsheviks. Now, Michael will be badly wounded at the Battle of Stalingrad in the winter of 1942-43, but was lucky to get out of the Eastern Front alive. About half of the Danish Free Corps died there in service to Hitler. This Danish SS brigade was relatively large and remains a black mark against the country. Norway, for example, had only a slightly smaller population. By the way, it was brainwashed with much more Nazi propaganda, but only 1,000 Norwegians volunteered in the SS. Sweden had only a few hundred. Again, the Danes sent 6,000. Okay, we can remove those posters. Thank you. Now, on the opposite side of the ideological spectrum is Sven, the son of the family's beloved chief housekeeper and himself working as a machinist on the estate. Let's have the next image of Sven. Now, he is a communist, hardly uncommon among European youth in the 1930s. These were idealists who wanted a better world, and they glorified the Soviet Union, dismissing reports of Stalin's monstrous crimes. Sven was among the 50,000 or so foreigners who fought against Franco in the Spanish Civil War in the international brigades, organized and supported by the Soviets. So you see, he's really the mirror opposite of Michael. Michael fights in a foreign war for the fascists. Sven goes to the Spanish Civil War to fight against them. Now, following the German invasion of Denmark, Sven turns to fighting the fascists at home. And communists like him were a major part of the Danish resistance. Okay, can you remove that slide? Now, what was the nature of this defiance? Both for communists and others, it was nonviolent for the first year and a half, consisting of clandestine anti-German newspapers, like the one you see Axel reading in his home, which angers his father. There was anti-Nazi graffiti. There was a bit of vandalism against Wehrmacht vehicles. And there was spying for the British, but not much more. This was an opposition so tame that several of the memoirs of that time focus merely on giving the German soldiers the cold shoulder. It's the same expression in Danish, kolde skulder, meaning rude or impolite. They wouldn't shake hands with a German in uniform or would get up and move away if he sat next to them on a bus or in a restaurant. That's about as nonviolent as you can get. Another example is that of a popular comedian in Copenhagen who, seeing Wehrmacht officers in the front row of the theater, began his act with his right arm stretched out like a Hitler salute. When the Germans jumped up and shouted Heil Hitler, the performer, still imitating the Nazi gesture, said, "This is how high the snow was in Copenhagen last winter." And the audience laughed at their occupiers. So a resistance of ridicule, so to speak. Now, this low-key response was certainly due to the relatively mild occupation, but also because the Kremlin discouraged armed opposition to Nazi rule during that Soviet non-aggression pact with Germany, signed in August 1939. But everything changed with Hitler's invasion of the USSR in June 1941. Denmark was soon compelled to sign the Anti-Comintern Pact, which meant officially joining the war against the Soviet Union. They were not obliged to send troops, but they were forced to outlaw the Communist Party, ban its publications, and in turn, hundreds of its members. In the film, the Danish police come for Sven, and he is killed in a shootout with them. This crackdown ignited armed resistance. And we see Axel, who ultimately joins a communist cell and undertakes sabotage, blowing up a German military depot, and so on. Non-communists as well joined because they saw the repression as a gross violation of the accommodation agreement. making a mockery of Danish independence. Beyond that, by now it was becoming likely that Hitler was going to lose the war. And few people wanted to be seen as having been on his side when peace arrived. So the resistance grew over the next 2 years and was the main reason Berlin ended the period of accommodation, imposed martial law, and ruled with an iron hand beginning in August 1943. Of course, that inflamed the Danes more than anything. And with their own police gone, there was no buffer between themselves and the Germans. Violent opposition further surged after the British parachuted in 600 tons of weapons and about 50 agents. All told, the resistance fighters killed an estimated 400 Danish Nazis, informers and collaborators. And they themselves lost twice as many men and women who were killed in action, executed, or sent to concentration camps in Germany. But a controversy in recent years has been the methods of this vaunted resistance. Were their targets sometimes the result of personal vendettas rather than Nazi collaboration? Several Danish films show the moral ambiguity of the resistance movement. Moreover, a number of historians feel that it wasn't that effective, in that the Germans never had to bring in more troops to put it down. Maybe its primary effect was to raise Danish morale. Yet there is no argument around the heroic rescue of the Jews in October 43, unquestionably the jewel in the crown of the Danish resistance. In other countries, the resistance did not prioritize the Jews, but in Denmark it did. As the litmus test of their national integrity, defending the Jews meant defending Danish freedom, because the small Jewish community had been fully integrated into society. That was reflected in the very high rate of intermarriage there. Some of the leading Danish authors and literary critics were Jews, as was the renowned physicist, Nobel laureate, Niels Bohr, who was one of those rescued in the boat lift, along with his family. He then went on to Britain and ultimately Los Alamos to help develop the atomic bomb. Now, for a country to have prominent Jews is, of course, no guarantee against anti-Semitism. It can even have the reverse effect, instilling envy and suspicion, as Germany itself shows. But Denmark also had a long democratic tradition going back to the mid-19th century. Its political culture was more like Britain than the continental nations. It felt fiercely protective of all of its citizens. Also, many who participated in the boat lift did so out of guilt for having been so passive earlier during the period of accommodation. You know, Churchill famously said, "Denmark is Hitler's canary. It sings any tune he wants." There's a full-length book entitled Hitler's Canary, but also a rejoinder playing up the Danish resistance called Hitler's Savage Canary. Controversy abounds, with one camp emphasizing collaboration and the other stressing resistance. Now to the next character, Axel, who becomes radicalized over the course of the occupation under the influence of his friend Sven. A turning point for him was the Danish government joining the anti-Comintern pact. Let's look at the next slide. Here is Axel demonstrating against Denmark being forced to sign that anti-Comintern pact. His anger and that of the other protesters is directed toward the Danish foreign minister, Erik Scavenius, a longtime conservative politician and the architect of the accommodation plan, and a highly contentious figure to this day. Unsurprisingly, his political career was over after 1945. He was considered an appeaser. But it's telling that most Danes did not feel he had criminal intent, rather that he tried to do the best he could for Denmark. And in sharp contrast with Norway's Quisling, Scavenius was never put on trial. Okay, we can remove that. And let us have the next slide. Finally, I want to come to the character of Helene, Carl and Eva's only daughter, who falls in love with and marries a German naval officer, you see on the bottom image, and lives with him on the base in Trondheim, Norway, as we said. Such liaisons, not only in Denmark, but throughout Nazi-occupied Europe, were not unusual. In Seaside Hotel, there's a romance between a young Danish woman and a Wehrmacht officer. It's estimated that tens of thousands of French children were fathered by German soldiers there. And a recent book finally addresses that topic, which had been taboo. Okay, we can remove that slide. Now, how were women who consorted with the Germans treated after the war? In France, there was a frenzy of hatred toward them. It's estimated that 20,000 French women had their heads shaved by angry mobs, a sign of shame and humiliation dating back to the Middle Ages. But such retribution was rare in Denmark. The Danes had suffered less than the French and less than every other occupied country. They were not as vengeful at war's end. And they value national unity, as seen in the decision not to punish the wartime leader, Scavenius. They simply wanted to move on, to live convivially and enjoy the post-war prosperity. This fits a cultural sensibility or mindset that is widespread in Denmark. The Danish word for it is hygge, meaning cozy, comfortable, and content. Something like gemütlich in German, but encompassing a whole lifestyle. So when they did look back at the occupation, they highlighted the resistance and the boat lift, of course, but little else. But in the past 2 decades, that incomplete view, comfortable though it was, that retreat into genial hygge has changed. In 2005, the Danish Prime Minister, a conservative, publicly apologized for his country's shameful refugee policy toward the Jews. He referred to it as a stain on Denmark's reputation. So we can thank the Danes for their noble wartime act, the boat lift. And we can now thank them again for facing up to their ignoble acts. Thank you very much.